Well, first of all, I suppose I ought to apologise in advance. I was asked to do the talk at fairly short notice, so I didn't have time to swat up on Kishtagarbha Bodhisattva specifically. So if you've got complex questions about Kishtagarbha, at the end I might have to defer to one of the other monks. And so, but luckily, in Buddhism, if you take one theme, they're usually connected to quite a few of the other threads of the Dharma, aren't they? So you can start in one place and get to almost the same place. So luckily, the talk I had for another occasion is pretty much okay. Now, the litany of Kishtagarbha does speak of Shakyamuni Buddha telling Kishtagarbha not to allow anyone to stay in hell for a day and a night, I think. And I think later on, doesn't the litany talks about the millions of transformations of Kishtagarbha, and it kind of has a resonance with me with the scripture of Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva that you might know a bit better, because she appears in all places to save beings appropriate to their situation as well. And it says there is not a place where Kanzeon does not go. So you can see these sort of descriptions of compassion that are where it's embodied in a form like Jizo or Kanzeon. They are pointing to something a little bit deeper. And how can one being have millions of transformations? How can one being help in every possible situation? And I think the purpose is to really expand your mind, if you like. That's what the Mahayana scriptures do. They're like pushing at the limits of your credulity, in a sense. And what is compassion, and how does compassion appear for you in your particular situation? Because that's the point. It's got to be your particular thing. It can't be an abstraction. One of the things that's arisen recently within the meditation group I go to, Huddersfield, which I found quite helpful, was some discussion about the response to the Ukraine war and also response to the climate emergency. Because there's a mixture in each meditation group, but some of them quite interested in a bit more active stuff, and I think one of them took part in a peaceful sit outside the Glasgow, wherever it was they had the conference, and questions about what is appropriate action, questions about how do we deal with what seems to be a hopeless situation sometimes. I think we're all shocked by the Ukraine war. I used to teach history, and I thought, gosh, I thought we'd got past the Second World War type stuff. It just looks the same, So the scriptures that make really bold claims that compassion exists everywhere, they become quite challenging for everyone, I think. And this isn't, though, a reason to ignore them. In the scripture of Kanzeon, it does say something like, you must not cherish thoughts of doubt about great Kanzeon. To me, that doesn't mean that you can never have a doubt, because we do. When you look at the news, we do. It's just the cherishing, perhaps, the holding on to the doubt. That's what it's pointing at. We don't have to carry a set of beliefs or ideas around with us all the time like a defence. We do have to allow ourselves to doubt on those occasions, to really feel it. But on the other hand, we mustn't fall into despair or a kind of cynicism. I mean, it could be quite easy to say to yourself, well, if the world's just dominated by crazy people like Putin or whatever, you could add to your list, In my day, we blamed Mrs. Thatcher for quite a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Then what's the point in bothering? Why bother? because someone's just going to start a war somewhere anyway. And it's difficult for people who genuinely feel the connection with other people's suffering and really want to respond. And I had a really thoughtful email from someone in the Huddersfield group, and he talked about the difference between sort of a false kind of optimism and what he called active hope. And it was I found it very useful myself. I think the distinction was that optimism can be like a mental game where you, if you see something awful, you try and come up with thoughts that counter that. Oh, it's all right really on some level, or it will end soon, or it's not that bad really. But that's a very fragile kind of thing, isn't it? I think, when you watch the news, if things are going okay one day, you might feel okay, but if they get worse, then you go into a dip. Points out how fragile that kind of optimism is. And I think it's because it's too based on an abstraction, too based on expectation that you're going to see the results of actions. And perhaps a neediness in ourselves that we so much want our efforts to be recognised. Some people have taught that we need to act for good without expectation, which is quite a challenge. There's one author, some of you probably heard of, Joanna Macy, and I'll just read a bit from that, because this is what this chap emailed me about. And she describes hope as a state of being in the present in which one acts regardless of outcome. So active hope is like a practice. It's like Tai Chi or gardening. It is something we do rather than something we have. It is a process that we can apply to any situation, and it involves 3 key steps. First, we take in a clear view of reality. Second, we identify what we hope for in terms of the direction we'd like things to move in. And third, we take steps to move ourselves or our situation in that direction. Since active hope doesn't require our optimism, we can apply it even in the areas where we feel hopeless. The guiding impetus is intention. We choose what we aim to bring about, act for, or express. Rather than weighing our chances and proceeding only when we feel hopeful, we focus on our intention and let it be our guide. By the way, Joanna Macy, I think she practices more in a Theravadan tradition, but it resonates for me anyway. So I have been reading Great Master Dogen's chapter in Shobogenzo, Cease from Evil. And it struck me just how close his teaching was really. When you look behind some of the more obscure Japanese terms, it feels very, very close to me. Especially in that he talks about ceasing from evil and doing only good as activities based on a real dynamic approach to sitting, to really engaging with the situation. In fact, he constantly criticised the view that these could be abstractions. I'll get to that in a bit. But I thought it'd be nice to use a visual aid, because Dogen's commenting on a story that this is a picture of. And you'll see that there's a chap here. I won't get up because I've got a camera on me, but the chap there with a servant, I think, or follower, and he's a governor and a poet of a province of China, I think, in the Tang period. I'll just read a bit, D.T. Suzuki's version of the story. When the great poet was officiating as governor in a certain district, there was a Zen master within his jurisdiction, popularly known as the bird's nest, for he used to practice his meditation on a seat made of the thickly growing branches of a tree. The governor poet once visited him and said, "What a dangerous seat you have up in the tree." "Yours is far worse than mine," retorted the master. "I am the governor of this district and I don't see what danger there is in it." "Then you don't know yourself. When your passions burn and your mind is unsteady, what is more dangerous than that?" The governor then asked, "What is the teaching of Buddhism?" The master recited this famous stanza, "Not to commit evils, but to practice all good, and to keep the heart pure. This is the teaching of all the Buddhas." The governor protested, "But any child of 3 knows that." "Any child of 3 years old may know it, but even an old man of 80 years finds it difficult to practice it." So concluded the Zen master up in the tree. I really like that story for some reason. I don't know if he permanently lived up in his tree, but I think he might have just done his sitting up there. At least I hope not. So Dogen's comments on this story are in his chapter Shoaku Makusa. And he says, what a pity it was that the poet didn't understand the profundity of the teaching. It sounds like a simple verse, but it's not. Because the governor had not touched upon the Buddha's teaching, did the governor understand the child's inherent capacity? Those who understand know that a 3-year-old child also understands all Buddhas in all 3 worlds. Those who understand a speck of dust understand the whole world. Those who master one thing master myriad things. So Dogen really criticises the poet for underestimating the child's practice, and also not understanding just how deep that old verse is. Refrain from evil, do only good, and purify your heart. There's different translations of it, but this one is from Tanahashi, and they've used unwholesome action instead of evil. They're all correct. Even a man of 80 cannot practice it, Dogen says. It is the practice of the unattainable. So just as we take the Bodhisattva vows to save all living beings, however innumerable they may be, we still take the vow and practice it. It's unattainable, but we still do it. And that's quite similar, isn't it, to what Jhana Macy was saying. We have the intention regardless. You're not expecting to know if I've saved all sentient beings. It is enough just to practice. So to go through Dogen's chapter from the beginning a bit more, it starts, ancient Buddhas say, refrain from unwholesome action, do wholesome action. Purify your own mind. This is the teaching of all Buddhas. This teaching has been authentically transmitted from earlier Buddhas to later Buddhas of the future as the precepts from the earlier Buddhas. This teaching is not limited to the 7 Buddhas, it is the teaching of all Buddhas. He later says that if someone teaches you Buddhism but they don't include this, they're not teaching you Buddhism. So I think that's saying, like, if someone tries to leave the precepts out, then they might not be a good teacher. It is the precepts of all the Buddhas from the 7 original Buddhas before Shakyamuni. And those of you who've been to Jukai will probably remember the beginning of the commentary on the precepts. The great precepts of the Buddhas are kept carefully by the Buddhas. Buddhas give them to Buddhas, ancestors give them to ancestors. The precepts of the Buddhas are beyond the 3 existences of past, present and future, Enlightenment ranges from time eternal and is even now. I'm just going to jump ahead a bit to another section. This is by Reverend Hubert, and this is a free translation you can get from the Shasta Abbey website. Rouse your heart and mind fully and do your training and practice. For when you rouse your heart and mind to do the training and practice, you will have already realised 8 or 9/10 of the way. Before you know it, you will have refraining always in the back of your mind. Whether you pay heed to your own handling of body and mind whilst doing your training and practice, or pay heed to someone else's handling of body and mind, the strength from your practice and training with the 4 elements and the 5 skandhas will be instantly manifest before your very eyes. At such a time, the 4 elements and the 5 skandhas will not sully you. Even with the 4 elements and the 5 skandhas being just as they are, at the present time, your training and practice can go on. The strength from the 4 elements and the 5 skandhas, just as they are in our present training and practice, has been brought about through our previous training and practice. Moreover, when we train and practice upon the great earth with its mountains and rivers, and beneath the sun, moon and stars, then the great earth with its mountains and rivers will help us to train ourselves and do the practice. So we train with what we've got. The 4 elements and the 5 skandhas are just everything that makes us up. The elements are like the early version of chemistry, I think. You know, the whole physical existence. And the skandhas are the form, sensation, thought, etc. We do not need to reject any part of ourselves in order to cease from evil, in other words. There's no duality of body and mind in this. We're not trying to get rid of body in order to liberate mind. It's the whole being, really, that we train with. And Dogen kind of turns it around. He says, because we train with what we are, then what we are helps us train. You know, when we train with the 5 skandhas, then the 5 skandhas help us train. And then he expands it out and says, you know, our own effort connects us with practice. When you move mountains, river and earth, as well as the sun, the moon and stars to practice, they in return move you to practice. I find that quite beautiful, really. And it's talking about this mutual giving and receiving. When we kind of give ourselves, offer ourselves, it's as if the mountains and rivers support us in many ways, actually. We are affirmed, and the affirmation supports the practice, so it continues. And this is the same, isn't it, as many things within our practice. Something as simple as bowing, for example. If we had to know exactly what bowing was and decide whether it's worth doing beforehand in an abstract sense, before we did any bowing, would we ever know what bowing was? And I think the Zen tradition would say no, you just bow. And in bowing there is the affirmation, and the affirmation helps you. It's like when you bow to your cushion, or your whatever you sit on, you recognise that it's helping you, supporting you. And somehow it doesn't work any other way. You can't not bow to it and know that. You have to kind of make the movement. And it's very much the case with Dogen, I think you'll find. That's why I said earlier that he really emphasised activity. There isn't a good out there that is just waiting to be done. We have to do it, and then good appears. That's what he seems to be saying. So we'll move on to do only good, or do wholesome action. Do wholesome action. This wholesome action is one of the three natures. Although there are many varieties of wholesome actions, there is no wholesome action that is already actualized and waiting for someone to practice it. At the very moment of doing wholesome action, there is no wholesome action that does not come forth. Although myriads of wholesome actions are formless, they arrive at the place where wholesome action is done, faster than a magnet drawing iron. Its power is stronger than a Virambaka storm. That's a great wind. At the moment of choosing to do good, all conditions help and support the doing, and it draws good towards it. And I think one of the implications of this is how important it is not to be too abstract and think in terms of how things were in the past. The implication is that good isn't something fixed in the past, but an expression of our response to what is needed now, at the moment. So we tend to ask ourselves, what is good to do in this situation? We don't carry around rule books in our heads too often, knowing ahead of time what is good. As I said, it would be quite easy to fall into different versions of cynicism, which actually Buddhism usually classifies as a kind of despair, or an excuse not to do anything. But Dogen also addresses that. Even if unwholesome action fills worlds upon worlds and swallows up all things, refrain from, or ceasing from evil, is emancipation. Wholesome action is wholesome action in the beginning, middle and end. It is a true marked substance and activity of do only good. He's saying that ceasing from evil or do only good has intrinsic merit that can't be measured. It's part of the teaching that, as he said at the very beginning, those who understand a speck of dust understand the whole world. It's part of that teaching. And in one of his teachings, he says that if we offer even a speck of dust, it has inconceivable merit. So we're not talking about something that can be measured and compared. We're talking about at that moment of doing, choosing to do that good, it has consequences that kind of just ripple out, spread. They're immeasurable. I think too often we undervalue the efforts we make because society doesn't tend to measure things like that. Society tends to measure the big, the quantifiable, like, how many buildings have been blown up in Ukraine and how many, you know what I mean? It won't measure the fact that you've been a bit more patient on the phone with your mum or something. But he's saying that they all have intrinsic merit that is almost timeless. Wholesome action is wholesome action in the beginning, middle and end. And this is a reference actually to the Lotus Sutra, for those of you who like your references, where it says, Buddhas alone, together with Buddhas, are directly able to realize that all dharmas are real form. What is called all dharmas is form as it is, the nature as it is, body as it is, energy as it is, action as it is, causes as they are, conditions as they are, effects as they are, results as they are, and the ultimate state of equality as substance and detail as it is. Now that's a bit complicated, I must admit, but he's talking about the fact that the doing of good connects to a dynamic activity of reality, really. put it in a nutshell. And it involves cause and effect. Cause and effect express the truth. But we have to choose to act in accord with cause and effect. And a lot of teaching on karma is about choosing to act most appropriately for the situation, recognising there's always consequences for your actions. So good doing is very active. It's an act of faith. We have to live as faith rather than just contemplate it as an idea. But in order to see to appreciate this, I guess, or to kind of awaken to this more, we have to drop our own opinions and judgments quite often. I quite like what Reverend Wilfrid said, his dedication, that I only just heard it then, but he said something like, Jesus waits at the gate, and he's telling us not to be critical, not to be too judgmental. It's good advice. In order to see that the dynamic activity, the beauty of that, in a sense, we do have to drop our judgments. It is very easy to fall into blame and judgment, but it takes us off the hook of responsibility, really, doesn't it? If we say everything is wrong, and if we blame Boris, or we blame Putin, or we blame Brexit, or we can go, then we don't have to do anything, do we? You know, we don't have the problem of wondering what the heck to do in this difficult situation. So that's not an option, really. That's judgment leading to cynicism. So we need to really work at our own judgmentalism. I've probably said this before. The example for me that was still current, I suppose, is the time I realised when my divisive mind was sort of making things very difficult for me, was when I was in France looking after my father, who had cancer, and he was already terminal by then. I think he had 6 months, and I was helping my mum look after him, and we had a huge argument about the porridge, as you know, as one does, because he knew he was dying, but you know, I tried to make it as nice as I could, and he said, "Oh, it's rubbish," you know, and I kind of stormed out on a walk and took the dog for a walk, and you know, as usual, your mind's sort of shooting around, what the heck, you know, you kind of, a lot of anger. But I guess being in the nice countryside really helped, the trees and the hills and the views, because I sort of thought, well, none of the trees and the hills and the mountains are actually making this noise, are they? You know, they're not criticising, they're not annoyed. So it was just my mind, really. It was completely my mind. It's like a mirror. And you know, things can teach in that sense. Sometimes we see that we're projecting everything onto the world, and then we think the world's awful. But you can turn it around, because reality isn't like that. So that's an example of seeing how the cause and effect within existence, we can appreciate it a bit more. Because after all, one of the things I was doing was automatically assuming that dying and cancer, etc., were completely wrong, made it almost impossible to accept. And life is always good. But they can't be, can they? You know, life couldn't always be good, because we all die. I mean, but sometimes in the heat of the moment, we forget all that stuff, and we really have to go a bit deeper and drop even what seem to be acceptable judgments aren't actually, if you take it deep enough, are actually going to block your ability to help. There is cause and effect, But as Dogen says, those who only know that unwholesome action arises through causes and conditions, and do not see that causes and conditions themselves are refrained from, should be pitied. Because Buddha seeds come forth through conditions, conditions come forth through Buddha seeds. That's quite a remarkable statement, really. It implies a huge faith in the nature of existence, that conditions themselves are Buddha seeds. Buddha seeds come forth through conditions, and the conditions come forth through Buddha seeds. Again, it's like this dynamic circle. I think it's very important, though, not to take these things that are kind of saying it's the benevolent universe, aren't they, on one level, but in a much, much more dynamic way. But don't take it as a belief or a doctrine that you have to believe in, because it doesn't work apart from anything else. And it's not the Zen way, not the way of Buddhism, I would say. I don't think we can work at making our minds believe in optimistic doctrines. I think we can only work on dropping the judgments, which is more how we sit. We don't deliberately, when we do Zazen, we're not deliberately contemplating something, we're not visualizing wonderful stuff, we're just sitting with things as they are. And I think to trust existence also is impossible in the abstract. And this is why we have our practice. We have to ground ourselves where we are. So if we're visiting someone in a difficult situation, we have to trust that we can be there in that situation, in that moment, and respond accordingly. You know, I found it, I think most of you know, I had visiting Reverend Alexander for 2 years in the care home, and because of COVID, there weren't that many people allowed to for long periods. And when I went with a sense of expectation, and you know, I thought I'm going to say this and then I'm going to do that, and it never worked. It never works anyway with people who are kind of, you know, quite far advanced in an illness. And but what does work is there is usually some response if you're willing to just be there and feel quite uncomfortable. So that's an example. We can't really carry a doctrine or you know, everything is wonderful type doctrine around without being a bit of a pain, quite frankly. But we have to sit still in the heart of our fears, really. And then we can be open to the possibility that the ordinary, you know, our ordinary life and death is the life of Buddha. And I think this is what the scriptures are talking about, the Kishtigarbha Sutra and the scripture of Avalokiteshvara, that if we're willing to let go of our views, we can see that compassion is not limited by anything, not anything practical or anything at all. And then, you know, obviously it's not limited even in hell. This is what Jesus is about. And I think it also points to the fundamental value of Zazen. Because in Zazen, we're not trying to be anything else. We actually are expressing our faith in existence by just doing it. Could be saying it's just enough as it is. I'll probably just finish with that nice quote from Dogen, which is the Tanahashi. When you move mountains, rivers and earth, as well as the sun, the moon and stars to practice, they in return move you to practice.